who's like 3.5 years older than me. So my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and my sister was off at school. So for about 3 years there or so, I was just like hanging out with my mom, who was an only child and didn't know about play dates and socializing her sons. Like, so I was just hanging out by myself in this house and looking at books. And I'd say, tell my mom that I was bored. So sit down and I'll, here's some paper. Keep yourself busy with doing drawing. And I think early on, I was like copying things, like copying a book cover. And I remember one day, a very specific moment of just like, I think as a child, you can usually tell like a genuine adult response. And I remember I had done some drawing that was copying these knights in armor or something like that. And then just seeing this guy like, oh, this is really good. And not just kind of trying to pat you on the head. And so obviously you think about any response like that, like, oh, I want more of that. And so that was just like the kind of very early core memory of like, I enjoyed drawing, but I also had a response.
Yeah, hearing you talk about like getting this validation and that being so important because it's so true. I think that often adults want to encourage kids and they think that kids are not as emotionally attuned as they really are.
Right.
Whereas kids are probably, if there's one thing they're good at, it is emotional attunement, right?
Right.
And sensing when someone is sincere. And also interesting that you pointed out it was a bit unusual that you had parents that were like into comics. It was something that was not necessarily like the most top respected art form at the time.
We moved around quite a bit, but I felt like I got settled like probably at the end of grade school in Seattle. And just the friends that I made around there was no one who was interested in comics and that sort of thing. And it was very clear to me that hearing references from my friends' parents and things like that, that it was still had this kind of stigma attached to it. It's like, okay, this is something you might be able to read it, but then you throw it in the garbage. It's not something you're going to hang on to or consider important. But in my house, it wasn't something that was encouraged, but it wasn't discouraged either. And so I tried to stay under the radar. I just behaved myself as much as I needed to, just so I could walk down to the woods and smoke a joint and come back and draw stoner drawings in my bedroom.
That's not bad, if you can get away with that as a kid, you're
I got away with it most of the time, not every time, but yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask a little bit about your early career because it's interesting. Yeah, comics were for a long time seen as something where it's like they're cheap. It's often superhero stuff,
Right.
kids stuff that was not taken seriously as an art form. And when you were first starting out in your career in the early 1980s, we didn't have quite the same culture around graphic novels
Right, yeah,
being
not at
seen as
all.
this like serious art form, and you struggled a bit to find a place in the comic scene, from what I understand.
Mhm.
And a lot of your early work was in Raw magazine that was being published in New York by Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly. What was the impact of that era and Raw magazine on you and your career?
Well, after I graduated from high school, I went to art school, and I just had this very vague idea of like I've always drawn. I like comics, but I saw myself as an artist. So I did painting and printmaking and did a whole lot of tried a whole lot of different things. But I was always doing like kind of my comic work on the side, and I'd never met another cartoonist, a professional cartoonist. And it's a long story, but eventually I got to meet Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly, and I had seen the very first issue of Raw on the stands in New York City because I was up there trying to show my portfolio around, and I kind of instantly thought, oh, this is this kind of publication that I've always imagined, this kind of oversized, beautifully printed, and there's this kind of oddball, intense graphics, this graphic quality. And initially, Art serialized his book Mouse in little pamphlets in the magazine. So anyway, Art was the first person I met, and he was a great person to meet because he had just an incredible knowledge of the history of comics, and he was the first person who really looked at that side of my work very seriously. And I think one of the first times we sat down and talked, and I brought up a whole stack of drawings, and there was one page that was kind of a series of abstract images, interrelated images, and he was just looking silently for a long time. I started getting nervous, like, oh, and I started trying to kind of point out, explain what this thing was about. Like, no, 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 that's against the rules. I thought, oh, I get it. He's just looking at it very carefully. He's taking it it seriously.
Mhm.
And so, in a way, we're talking about validation. That was a certain amount of validation for me as well. And we're still close friends after all these years. And he was incredibly helpful and generous in that I would visit regularly. And it's like, oh, do you know so and so? And like, no, I've never heard of that. He had kind of access to all these exotic European authors that I'd never heard of, and stacks of books. And it was this incredible education for me just to be suddenly meeting other artists, talking with him for hours on end. So yeah, that was really kind of the starting point of finding my way into getting my comics published.
That's so cool to hear about, because I think for me, as for so many people, Art Spiegelman was my entry point into
Yeah, I
the
think
world
for
of,
so many people.
yeah, comics, graphic novels. As you said, like he wrote Mouse. It was like got a special Pulitzer because they
Yeah.
didn't even know at that point like
Right.
how to categorize the work. They were like, this is serious, like journalistic almost reporting, but also art, but also comic. What do we do?
Yeah.
And then Françoise Mounier has been the art editor at the New Yorker for years.
Yeah.
And I think that this sort of common thread between the work that they've done and your work, and really this like world of comics that sort of developed through people that were getting published in Raw in the 80s, is there's this like dark sensibility and ability to grapple with very deep, sometimes sinister subject matter. Your work in particular has a like dystopian and surreal vibe a lot of the time. If I look back at like Black Hole, for instance, there's definitely like an eeriness to it. Final Cut, I would say, has a lot of that dread, teenage angst, surrealism, particularly in the dream sequence, but it's also very grounded in real life and real teenage problems. And there's a bit of like a hope and redemption vibe towards the end of the story. It doesn't end on a particularly dour note. Brian is in an interesting place at the end of Final Cut, I would say, where he, a bit being stymied in some of his artistic and romantic pursuits, a little bit disappointed and frustrated, but he also has this ability to kind of write his own narrative, that he has this amazing imagination. He has clearly a lot of artistic inspiration that he's drawing from some of these experiences that are difficult. And that gives him a bit of an ability to control his own story
Right.
and exert some agency, which is something that teenagers often are lacking.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what art can offer people that are maybe experiencing these kinds of personal, professional, romantic, whatever frustrations.
For me, it's always just this kind of odd urge to tell this story. I can't explain it in any other way. I'm never thinking of an audience. I mean, obviously you're working for print and you anticipate that there's a book that's going to come out or some kind of publication. But for me, the urge is always, it's not therapeutic. It's some inexplicable thing I can't quite put into words. It's this urge to tell that story or it's formulating ideas as you're working. And I've never believed in the idea that if you kind of express these things and and you get it out of your system, they're obviously still in my system. But yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot in there. The idea that you're talking about, that there's just this like drive and this engine that I think a lot of creative people have, where it sounds like you're the sort of person, and the character Brian in Final Cut is the sort of person that would want to make art even if there was no one to see it. Like there was just a need to tell these stories and a need to express.
Yeah, I would definitely be doing something, whether it was going down to my little local print shop and printing up some Xerox copies of my comics or something. Yeah, I would find something. I feel I've been incredibly lucky to find an audience that's interested in my work. But there's something that happens when I'm sitting at a table, and every once in a while it's just like, oh, this is working, and there's something that's happening there that is, I can't explain it, but it's like feeding back to you. Something is feeding you something that's strong, and that's what I'm kind of still chasing after, that feeling of like, oh, discovery. You discover something new.
That's so beautiful to hear that that's still a feeling that you can
Oh,
get
yeah.
after having, a long career in so many different phases of it. Charles, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you, and I myself have been trying to like get more into an artistic and creative practice that's not my job, and I think hearing you talk about this process and the drive to create and just to sit down at the table and let things flow, it makes me want to go home and write in my journal.
Oh, good. I mean, that happens to me as well. Every once in a while, there'll be like something that inspires you. Like, I need to go home and work. So yeah, I appreciate your close read on my final cut. I enjoyed your questions, so thanks.
Thanks so much. That was my conversation with Charles